White police officer attacked a black judge. Later karma hits him. It was a calm afternoon in the affluent suburb of Greenwood Heights. For Officer Davis, it was just another routine day on patrol, but his mood shifted when he spotted a sleek black car driving through the neighborhood. It wasn't the type of car or driver he was used to seeing in this part of town, and something about it set him on edge. Without hesitation, he flipped on his sirens and sped up behind the car, signaling the driver to pull over. The vehicle came to a smooth stop at the curb, and Officer Davis stepped out of his cruiser, his hand resting on his holster. As he approached the driver's side window, his eyes narrowed. Inside was a middle-aged black man, dressed in a sharp business suit, sitting calmly with his hands on the wheel. "License and registration," Davis barked, his voice sharp. The man complied without hesitation, retrieving his wallet and pulling out his identification. He handed it to Davis, meeting his gaze with a steady, composed look. "What's the problem, officer?" the man asked, his tone respectful but firm. Davis glared at him, flipping through the documents without actually reading them. Something about the man's calm demeanor irked him. "You tell me," Davis replied with a smirk. "What are you doing around here?" "I'm on my way home," the man responded, his eyes never wavering. "I live just a few blocks away." Davis raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. He glanced back at the black car, as if expecting to find something wrong. "This your car?" The man nodded, his expression neutral. "Yes, it is." Davis leaned closer to the window, his voice lowering in suspicion. "You sure about that? You don't look like you belong around here." The man's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained calm. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. I'm on my way home. Is there a reason for this stop?" Davis ignored the question, his mind racing with assumptions. He didn't care about the man's answers. All he saw was someone who didn't fit in with the people who usually populated this upscale neighborhood. The more Davis stared at him, the more determined he became to assert his authority. "Step out of the car," Davis ordered, his hand now fully on his gun. The man hesitated, clearly weighing the consequences of refusing. He could see where this was heading, but he wasn't going to give Davis an excuse to escalate the situation further. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out onto the sidewalk. Davis stood over him, glaring. "Turn around and put your hands on the car." "For what?" the man asked, his voice controlled but clearly irritated now. "For resisting," Davis snapped. "You're not answering my questions." "I've answered every question you've asked," the man said calmly, though his patience was wearing thin. "I haven't broken any laws." Davis took a step closer, his chest puffed out, fueled by a mixture of ego and prejudice. "I said, put your hands on the car." Reluctantly, the man did as he was told, placing his hands on the sleek hood of his own vehicle. He could feel the eyes of nearby residents watching from their windows, but none of them would intervene. They never did. Davis began patting him down aggressively, searching for something, anything, to justify his actions. But there was nothing. No weapons, no drugs, no stolen items. Just a well-dressed man who clearly didn't belong in Davis's mind. Satisfied with his display of power, Davis pulled back and crossed his arms, still glaring at the man. "What's your name?" The man turned his head slightly, his calm exterior finally cracking as he looked Davis squarely in the eyes. "Marcus Reed." Davis froze for a second, as if the name should have triggered something, but he shrugged it off, dismissing the man as just another nobody. "Well, Mr. Reed, I'm going to run your license and see if you've got anything on your record." Reed nodded, silently enduring the humiliation. He knew better than to resist, but there was a fire burning behind his calm exterior. Davis had no idea who he was dealing with, and Reed wasn't going to reveal it just yet. There was a time and place for everything. As Davis walked back to his cruiser, Reed took a deep breath, glancing around at the neighborhood he called home. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him, but each time it left a bitter taste in his mouth. He wasn't just any man driving through this part of town. He was Judge Marcus Reed, one of the most respected legal figures in the state. But Officer Davis hadn't bothered to check his identification properly. He had already made up his mind about who Marcus Reed was before the stop even began. Back in his cruiser, Davis ran the license through the system, not realizing the gravity of his mistake. To him, it was just another routine stop, a chance to flex his authority over someone who didn't belong. He hadn't noticed the small detail on Reed's license, his title as a judge. As Davis sat in his car, waiting for the results, he smirked, still convinced that Reed was hiding something. He glanced over at the man, still standing by the car, and a small part of him felt satisfaction in putting Reed in his place. But Reed wasn't just a man in a suit. And this wasn't going to end the way Davis thought it would. Standing by his car, Marcus Reed maintained his composure, but his patience was running thin. He had endured situations like this before, but it never got easier. The blatant abuse of power, the assumptions, the disrespect, it was something he had fought against his entire life. As a judge, he had seen the impact of systemic racism firsthand, but today he was the one being targeted. In the patrol car, Officer Davis was still convinced that something was off about Reed. His name, his calm demeanor, it all made Davis feel like this man was hiding something. He hadn't found any outstanding warrants or issues with Reed's license, but that didn't stop him from wanting to push further. After what felt like an eternity, Davis stepped out of his cruiser, his jaw set with determination. The power he wielded as a police officer felt intoxicating, especially in moments like these when he could assert control over someone who seemed too sure of themselves. Walking up to Reed, Davis tossed the man's license back at him without a word of apology. "You're clear, but you're acting suspicious. Why were you driving so slow through this neighborhood?" Reed took a deep breath, gripping his license tightly before sliding it back into his wallet. "I was obeying the speed limit, officer. There was nothing suspicious about it." Davis narrowed his eyes, stepping closer, invading Reed's personal space. "You know, people who have nothing to hide don't get so defensive." Reed straightened, not backing down. "I'm not being defensive. I've answered all your questions. I've complied with everything you've asked. There's no reason for this to continue." But Davis wasn't listening. In his mind, Reed was challenging his authority, and that wasn't something he could tolerate. "You don't get to tell me how this works," Davis snapped. "I ask the questions. You answer them." The tension between the two men thickened. Reed could feel his anger rising, but he knew he couldn't let it show. The last thing he wanted was for Davis to escalate the situation further, but he could sense that it was already heading in that direction. "What are you hiding?" Davis asked again, his voice laced with accusation. "Why don't you just come clean now, and this will go a lot easier for you?" Reed's eyes hardened. He had been trying to avoid this, but Davis wasn't giving him a choice. "I'm not hiding anything. I've done nothing wrong," Davis scoffed, a mocking smile forming on his lips. "We'll see about that. Turn around and put your hands on the car." Reed's heart sank. This was exactly what he had feared. Davis was looking for an excuse, any excuse, to assert his authority. And now, it was clear that the officer had crossed a line. "Officer," Reed said, his voice steady but firm, "there's no reason for this. I'm not under arrest, and you have no right to detain me." Davis's face twisted with anger. "I said, put your hands on the car." When Reed hesitated, trying to reason with the officer, Davis grabbed him by the arm, roughly forcing him to turn around and pressing him against the hood of the car. The sudden aggression caught Reed off guard, and he winced as Davis tightened his grip, pushing him harder into the vehicle. "Is this necessary?" Reed asked, his voice strained but still calm. "You're resisting," Davis growled, pulling out his handcuffs. "Stop resisting." Reed wasn't resisting, and they both knew it. But Davis needed a justification for his actions, and claiming that Reed was resisting gave him the excuse he needed to escalate. Within moments, Reed's wrists were in cuffs, and Davis was patting him down roughly, his movements erratic as he searched for something. Anything that would validate his behavior. But just like before, there was nothing. Reed was clean. There were no weapons, no illegal substances, no stolen goods. Just a man who had been driving home. The sound of Davis's heavy breathing filled the air as he finished the search. When he found nothing, his frustration grew. He looked at Reed, still pinned against the car, and felt a surge of anger. How dare this man question him, challenge his authority, and act like he was better than him? "You think you're special, huh?" Davis sneered, pulling Reed upright but keeping him in cuffs. "You think you can talk to me like that because you're wearing a suit?" Reed didn't respond. His mind was racing. He knew that no matter what he said, Davis was too far gone to listen. The situation had spiraled out of control, and now it was about power, not justice. At that moment, a few curious onlookers began to gather at a distance, watching the scene unfold. Some held up their phones, recording as Davis continued to berate Reed, unaware of how his actions were being captured. But it didn't matter. Davis was convinced he was in the right, and his ego wouldn't allow him to back down. The humiliation was almost unbearable for Reed. He was a judge, a man who upheld the law, and yet here he was, cuffed, searched, and treated like a criminal. But he knew better than to react. His power wasn't in his fists or his voice. His power lay in what would come next, and Davis had no idea the storm that was about to descend on him. Back at the station, things were quieter than usual. The officers going about their daily business had no idea that one of their own was on the verge of making the biggest mistake of his career. Sergeant Myers, a seasoned officer who had mentored Davis when he first joined the force, sat in his office, reviewing reports. He glanced up at the screen that displayed the body cam feeds from officers on patrol, casually watching the various stops and interactions throughout the city. It wasn't until he saw Davis's feed that something felt off. Myers narrowed his eyes as he watched Davis aggressively handle a man who appeared to be cooperating. The man was calm, composed, clearly not a threat. But Davis was treating him like he had just caught a dangerous criminal. "Davis, what the hell are you doing?" Myers muttered under his breath as he continued watching the footage. He felt a knot form in his stomach as the scene played out. Davis had always been a hothead, but this was different. This was something Myers couldn't ignore. Grabbing his radio, Myers called Davis. "Davis, what's your status?" There was a long pause before Davis finally responded. His voice clipped. "Routine stop." "Handling it." Myers frowned. "That doesn't look routine to me." "Bring him in, but do it by the book." The sergeant's words lingered in the air, but Davis didn't seem to care. His focus remained on Reed, a man he had already decided was guilty of something, even if he had no proof. As the minutes dragged on, Reed stood in silence, still in cuffs, enduring the weight of Davis's abuse. He didn't know who was watching or how this would end, but one thing was certain. This was far from over. Davis had crossed a line, and soon he would learn exactly who he had decided to humiliate. Officer Davis paced in front of the patrol car, his mind racing. He knew he hadn't found anything illegal on Marcus Reed, but his ego refused to let the situation end without him exerting full control. In his mind, this man had disrespected him, had dared to question his authority. And in Davis's world, that was enough to warrant arrest. The small crowd of onlookers had grown, many with their phones raised, recording every moment. It wasn't the first time Davis had seen people film him, But this time there was something unnerving about the number of eyes on him. Still, he wasn't about to back down. He couldn't lose face, not in front of them, and certainly not in front of this man who he believed was challenging him. Reed, now standing straight but still in handcuffs, watched Davis carefully. His silence wasn't born of fear, it was calculated. He was waiting, knowing full well that Davis was walking into a trap of his own making. But as the minutes ticked by, Reed also knew that this would soon become a matter of legal consequences, not just an abuse of power on the street. "Officer, there's no reason to arrest me," Reed said evenly, his voice calm despite the clear injustice he was facing. "I've complied with everything you've asked." Davis's jaw tightened. The calmness in Reed's voice only enraged him further. "You're under arrest," he snapped, stepping closer, his breath hot with anger. "For what?" Reed asked, his tone still composed. "You have no grounds to arrest me. I've broken no laws." Davis's eyes flashed with indignation. He needed to justify his actions, but his mind struggled to find a valid reason. The crowd's attention made him feel cornered, and he hated that feeling. In the heat of the moment, he made the decision that would seal his fate. "You're resisting," Davis said through gritted teeth, repeating the same false accusation from earlier. He reached for his radio. "Backup requested. I've got a suspect resisting arrest." The words felt hollow, even to him. He knew Reed hadn't resisted anything, but Davis was too far in to back out now. His pride wouldn't allow it. Reed let out a slow breath, glancing briefly at the crowd that had gathered. He could see the disbelief on their faces, the murmurs of shock at what was unfolding. They knew the truth. This wasn't about law enforcement. It was about ego, about power, and about race. But Reed wasn't here to plead his case on the street. He had a much bigger stage in mind for that. Davis grabbed Reed's arm roughly and began pulling him toward the patrol car. Reed didn't resist. He knew better than to give Davis any excuse to escalate further. As he was shoved into the back seat of the cruiser, the weight of the situation hit him, but not in the way Davis expected. Reed knew who he was. He knew the authority he held in courtrooms across the state. And more importantly, he knew what was coming next. But right now, Davis had no idea. As Davis drove back to the station, his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The radio crackled with routine calls, but none of it registered with him. His mind was consumed with frustration, replaying the encounter over and over. Why hadn't Reed just complied without question? Why had he forced Davis into this position? In the back of the car, Reed sat in silence. His eyes scanned the familiar streets of the neighborhood he had called home for years. The upscale homes, the quiet, well-kept lawns. This was supposed to be a place of peace, not a battlefield for justice. And yet, here he was, being driven to the police station as if he were a common criminal. He couldn't help but wonder how Davis would react when he realized who he had arrested. The thought brought him no joy, only a grim sense of inevitability. Davis wasn't just arresting any man. He was arresting Judge Marcus Reed, one of the most respected figures in the state judiciary. And that mistake would cost Davis more than he could ever imagine. At the station, Sergeant Myers was going over reports when the call came in. His eyebrows furrowed in confusion when he heard Davis's voice over the radio, requesting backup for a suspect resisting arrest. Myers had been watching the body cam footage earlier, and nothing about Reed's demeanor suggested resistance. He had seemed calm, almost too calm for someone being stopped by a police officer. Something didn't sit right with Myers, so he decided to check the footage again. As the screen flickered to life, Myers's stomach dropped. The scene was clear. Davis had escalated the situation without cause. Reed had been cooperative, and there had been no reason for the arrest. Myers leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Davis had just made a massive mistake. A few minutes later, the The patrol car pulled up outside the station, and Davis roughly led Reed out, marching him toward the entrance. Myers stepped out of his office just in time to see the two men enter the station, and his eyes locked onto Reed's face. There was something familiar about the man, but it wasn't until he glanced at the paperwork Davis had filled out that everything clicked. Judge Marcus Reed. Myers's face went pale. He couldn't believe it. Davis had arrested one of the most prominent judges in the state, and he hadn't even bothered to check his ID properly. This wasn't just a case of overreach. This was a disaster. Davis, Myers barked, causing the younger officer to flinch. Get in my office. Now. Davis looked confused but followed orders, leaving Reed in the holding area for processing. Myers could feel the weight of what was about to happen, and he wasn't sure if there was any way to stop it. In the holding area, Reed sat on a cold metal bench, his hands still cuffed. He was no stranger to police stations, but this was the first time he had ever been on this side of the bars. His mind raced, not with fear, but with the knowledge of what was to come. He knew that the legal system was now in his hands, and he had every intention of using it to its fullest extent. He heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see Sergeant Myers standing before him, his face pale with recognition. "Judge Reed," Myers began, his voice hesitant. I didn't realize it was you." Reed's expression remained calm. "I believe your officer didn't realize either." Myers swallowed hard. This is a misunderstanding. I'll have you out of here immediately." Reed stood slowly, the weight of the handcuffs still around his wrists. "It's too late for that, Sergeant. Your officer made his choice, and now he's going to have to face the consequences." Myers nodded grimly, knowing that this wasn't just about letting Reed go. The damage had been done. Davis had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now the fallout was inevitable. Back in the office, Davis sat across from Myers, still unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as if waiting for praise. "What's the problem, Sarge?" "I handled it by the book." Myers glared at him, barely containing his frustration. "By the book? You arrested Judge Marcus Reed." The color drained from Davis's face. "What? You didn't even bother to check who he was before escalating that situation," Myers continued, his voice low and furious. "You've just arrested one of the most powerful judges in the state." Davis sat in stunned silence. He hadn't checked the ID properly. He hadn't realized. And now it was too late. Myers leaned in, his voice cold. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." Inside the police station, the fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting a harsh glow over the stark white walls. The sounds of phones ringing, officers talking, and the occasional buzz of the front door being opened and closed filled the air. To everyone inside, this was just another day. Officer Davis strutted in with a smug sense of accomplishment, still gripping Marcus Reed by the arm as he dragged him toward the holding area. Reed's calmness seemed to agitate Davis even more. The officer was expecting some form of protest, some kind of outburst that would validate his actions, but Reed remained composed. "Let's get you processed," Davis muttered, unlocking the door to the holding area and pushing Reed inside. Reed's silence wasn't what he had expected, and it unnerved him. As they walked down the hallway, Sergeant Myers happened to glance up from his desk, catching sight of Davis escorting Reed. Myers frowned. There was something unsettling about the scene. The man in the suit didn't look like the typical suspect they brought in. He seemed calm, too calm for someone under arrest. And there was something else in his eyes, a quiet authority that gave Myers pause. "What's going on here?" Myers called out, standing up from his desk and walking toward Davis. "Routine stop," Davis replied dismissively. "Guy was acting suspicious, resisting. Figured I'd bring him in for questioning." Myers' eyes flicked to Reed, who gave him a measured, deliberate look. Something about it made Myers uncomfortable. He stepped closer, his tone lowering. "Davis, I hope you have a good reason for this. We can't afford any screw-ups right now. The department's under a lot of scrutiny." Davis scoffed, waving off the concern. "Relax, Myers. Everything's under control. This guy's been giving me attitude since the stop." "He's hiding something." Reed remained silent, his gaze shifting between the two officers. Myers was clearly uneasy, and Reed could tell that he was trying to gauge whether this situation was about to blow up. Without saying a word, Reed was allowing Davis to dig himself deeper into trouble. Myers sighed. "All right, but make sure everything's by the book. No cutting corners." Davis nodded, though his dismissive attitude didn't inspire much confidence. Myers hesitated for a moment longer before returning to his desk, but the nagging feeling that something was off didn't leave him. As Davis finished processing Reed's arrest, he led him into one of the small holding cells, locking the door behind him. Reed sat down on the bench inside, his hands still cuffed in front of him. He had been through worse situations in his life, but this one felt particularly bitter. Not because of the handcuffs or the holding cell, he had seen those before, but because Davis's actions were a direct reminder of how unchecked power could ruin lives. Hours passed, and Reed remained in the cell, quietly waiting. He wasn't worried. In fact, he was almost at peace, knowing that the longer this went on, the worse it would be for Davis. Eventually, this would reach the people who needed to know about it, and when it did, the entire situation would flip on its head. As the afternoon stretched into the evening, Reed's attorney finally arrived. When James Walters entered the station, his presence immediately drew attention. Walters was one of the most well-known lawyers in the state, and his arrival in a small-town police station was enough to make a few heads turn. When Walters reached the holding area, his face remained expressionless as he saw Reed sitting calmly behind the bars. Davis, who had been chatting with a fellow officer, looked up and froze when he saw Walters approaching. The lawyer's sharp suit and confident stride were enough to make him realize something wasn't right. "Officer," Walters said in a measured tone, "I'm here to see Judge Marcus Reed." Davis blinked, his smirk faltering for the first time. "Wait, what did you just say?" Walters turned to Davis, his gaze ice-cold. "You heard me. Judge Marcus Reed." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. For a moment, the entire station seemed to go silent. Davis's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. He had just arrested one of the most respected judges in the state, and he hadn't even bothered to check. Panic set in as the gravity of his mistake began to sink in. But it was too late. The damage was already done. The atmosphere inside the police station was unusually tense as Officer Davis walked in with Marcus Reed in handcuffs. Several officers glanced curiously at the scene but didn't question Davis, who was clearly in one of his moods. They had seen him act this way before, arrogant, aggressive, overstepping his authority. But today, something was different, though they couldn't yet put their finger on it. Reed remained silent, his hands still restrained behind his back, walking calmly beside Davis. He had learned long ago that maintaining composure was more powerful than reacting to situations like these. Even now, humiliated and degraded, he remained dignified, knowing that the moment of truth was coming soon. Davis, still puffed up with his perceived authority, shoved Reed toward the booking desk. "Sit tight," he muttered, as he moved toward the desk to start the paperwork. He shot Reed a glare, expecting him to show some kind of fear or submission, but Reed simply met his gaze with steady eyes. "Who is this?" asked Officer Thompson, who sat behind the desk, noting the lack of obvious charges or resistance from Reed. "Some guy acting suspicious," Davis replied, shrugging dismissively. "He wouldn't cooperate, gave me attitude. You know the type." Thompson frowned but didn't press the issue. He opened his computer and began typing in Reed's name from his ID. The moment he hit enter, his eyes widened. Wait, Marcus Reed? Thompson looked up, his expression confused. He glanced between Reed and Davis, clearly not understanding how this situation had escalated. Davis, already irritated by the lack of respect he thought he deserved, snapped, "Yeah, Marcus Reed. What's your point?" Thompson's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, then he cleared his throat awkwardly. "Marcus Reed? As in Judge Marcus Reed?" For the first time since the arrest, a flicker of confusion crossed Davis's face. "What are you talking about?" Thompson leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You arrested Judge Marcus Reed, Davis. He's one of the highest-ranking judges in the state." Davis's stomach dropped. His face paled as he processed what Thompson had just said. He turned slowly, staring at Reed, who now sat calmly in the chair, his expression unreadable. "Judge." The word echoed in Davis's mind like a bomb going off. He had arrested a judge. No, not just any judge, one of the most respected judges in the state. And worse, he had humiliated him, cuffed him, assaulted him. The reality of the situation came crashing down on Davis like a wave of ice-cold water. "No," Davis whispered under his breath, his chest tightening with panic. "You're joking, right? There's no way." But one look at Thompson's face told him everything he needed to know. There was no joke, no misunderstanding. Davis had just made the worst mistake of his life, and there was no undoing it. Reed, watching Davis closely, remained silent, letting the weight of the moment sink in. He didn't need to say anything. The truth was enough. Davis felt his pulse racing, his hands trembling slightly. How could he not have known? How could he have missed it? He had glanced at Reed's ID, but he hadn't paid attention. He hadn't cared to look. And now, that careless arrogance was going to cost him more than he could have ever imagined. Trying to regain control of the situation, Davis leaned toward Thompson. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice low and desperate. "We can't. I mean, he's a judge. This can't go public." Thompson raised his eyebrows. "You're asking me? You're the one who arrested him, Davis. This is on you." Davis shot a glance toward Reed, who still hadn't moved or spoken a word. He felt the room closing in on him, the walls pressing down. His career, his reputation, it was all slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He quickly turned to Reed, desperation in his voice. "Listen, Judge. I didn't know. I didn't." His words stumbled, lacking the usual confidence. "I was just doing my job. This is all a misunderstanding." Reed looked up at him slowly, his calm demeanor unnerving Davis even more. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated quietly, his voice steady. "You detained me without cause. You assaulted me. And you want to call it a misunderstanding?" Davis felt his throat tighten. He couldn't think of a single word to respond. The silence that hung in the air was suffocating. Reed stood up slowly, his wrists still bound by the cuffs. He stepped toward Davis, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. "I'm a judge, Officer Davis. I uphold the law, and today you broke it." Those words struck Davis like a blow to the gut. He had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. Before Davis could respond, the door to the station swung open, and a man in a sharp suit walked in, his expression serious. It was Jonathan Mitchell, Reed's attorney, who had been called the moment Reed was brought to the station. He took one look at the scene, Reed in handcuffs, Davis standing there pale and shaking, and his face hardened. "Uncuff him," Mitchell said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Davis hesitated, but Thompson quickly nodded and grabbed the keys, stepping forward to unlock the cuffs. The metal clinked as they fell away from Reed's wrists, and Davis felt another wave of panic rise in his chest. Reed rubbed his wrists lightly, then turned back to Davis. "You made a mistake, officer. A very serious one." Davis opened his mouth to speak, but Mitchell cut him off. "We'll be taking this matter up with the department," Mitchell said coldly. "Expect an internal investigation." Davis watched in stunned silence as Reed and his attorney walked out of the station, leaving him standing there, his world collapsing around him. His head was spinning, his future unraveling in front of his eyes. How had he been so blind? How had he not known? The officer's arrogance had led him to believe that he could get away with anything. But now, he was about to learn that karma had a way of catching up, especially when you abuse the power you've been given. The weight of the revelation hit Officer Davis like a ton of bricks. As the words Judge Marcus Reed echoed in his mind, his heart pounded in his chest. He had humiliated and arrested a man with immense power, someone who could easily destroy his career with a single phone call. Davis felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, and for the first time since the incident began, fear crept into his usually overconfident demeanor. Standing in the station's lobby, Judge Reed remained calm and composed, despite the chaos unfolding around him. His lawyer had already arrived, and now the situation was rapidly spiraling out of Davis's control. Officers who had previously deferred to Davis were now giving him questioning glances, unsure of what to do. They all knew who Judge Reed was, and now, so did Davis. As Davis stood frozen, staring at the judge, Sergeant Myers stormed into the room, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Davis, what the hell have you done?" Myers hissed, pulling him aside forcefully. The sergeant's grip on Davis's arm was tight, his frustration barely contained. "Two didn't know," Davis stammered, his usually authoritative voice now weak and shaky. He glanced nervously over at Reed, who was quietly conversing with his lawyer. He didn't say anything about being a judge. He was just acting suspicious. Myers glared at him, his eyes blazing with anger. "Acting suspicious? You've just arrested one of the most respected judges in the state. And for what? Driving through his own neighborhood?" Davis's stomach dropped. He knew Myers was right. There was no justification for what he had done, and the fact that it was Judge Reed only made things worse. The consequences of his actions were starting to become terrifyingly clear. I thought he was hiding something," Davis muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Myers shook his head, disgusted. "You're a damn fool. Do you even realize what kind of trouble we're in now? This isn't some minor incident we can sweep under the rug. This is going to blow up in our faces." Davis swallowed hard, his palms sweaty. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out, but the more he thought, the more he realized there was no escape. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. In the next room, Judge Reed sat with his lawyer, watching the chaos unfold. He had known this moment would come, the moment when Davis would realize just how badly he had messed up. Reed could see the panic in the officer's eyes, the way his bravado had crumbled in the face of the truth. It was almost ironic how the power dynamics had shifted so quickly. "You could have revealed who you were from the start," the lawyer said quietly, his voice curious but respectful. Reed nodded, his eyes still on Davis. "I could have. But then he wouldn't have shown his true colors." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "And now?" "Now he faces the consequences," Reed said simply, his tone calm but resolute. "People like Davis rely on their power and intimidation. He thought he could bully me because of what I look like. He never cared to check my ID, never bothered to listen. He just saw what he wanted to see." The lawyer gave a slight nod of understanding. "So what's the plan?" Reed sighed softly. "Let the department handle it first. I want to see if they're willing to do the right thing. But if they try to sweep this under the rug, Well, I won't stay silent. Reed had no intention of letting Davis off the hook, but he wanted to see how the police department would respond. If they failed to take appropriate action, he would have no problem taking this case to the courts, and to the public. Back in the station, Sergeant Myers was frantically trying to control the damage. He ordered Davis to take a seat in the back office while he consulted with the department's legal team and the chief. The reality of what had happened was beginning to sink in for everyone. The police department was now in the middle of a potential PR disaster, and they had no idea how to get out of it. Davis sat in the office, staring blankly at the wall. The adrenaline that had fueled him earlier was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. He had always operated with a sense of invincibility, believing that the badge protected him from the consequences of his actions. But now, the badge felt more like a target. He could lose everything: his job, his reputation, and possibly face legal action. His thoughts spiraled as he imagined the fallout. He pictured his face plastered across news outlets, social media erupting with outrage, protesters outside the station. And worst of all, he imagined Judge Reed standing in court, delivering the verdict that would ruin his life. The panic in Davis's chest tightened, making it hard to breathe. He had screwed up, and now there was nothing he could do to fix it. Hours later, after several frantic meetings and hushed discussions, Chief Harris entered the office where Davis sat, his face grave. The chief had a look of utter exhaustion, as though the weight of the situation had aged him years in just a few hours. "Davis," the chief began, his voice low and serious, "you've put us all in a terrible position. I've spoken with legal, and we're placing you on immediate suspension pending an investigation." Davis felt like the ground had fallen out from under him. Suspension. His voice was hollow, his mind still reeling. Chief Harris nodded, but his face was anything but sympathetic. "You assaulted and arrested a judge without cause. This is beyond bad. You're lucky if suspension is all you get." The words stung like a slap to the face. Davis had always thought of himself as a cop who could push boundaries, who could use his authority to assert control. But now, that same authority was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the chief left the room, Davis was left alone with his thoughts once more. His mind raced as he tried to grasp the full extent of his situation. This was the beginning of the end, and the fear of what was to come gnawed at him like a slow-burning fire. Meanwhile, Judge Reed and his lawyer walked out of the station, passing by the protesters who had begun to gather. News of the incident had already spread, and the community was rallying behind Reed. They wanted justice, and they weren't going to let this go quietly. Reed glanced back at the station as they left, knowing that Davis's reckoning was only just beginning. The wheels of justice were turning, and soon Davis would face the full force of the consequences he had so arrogantly ignored. The news of Officer Davis's arrest of Judge Marcus Reed had spread like wildfire. What began as a routine stop had turned into a national headline, and the town of Baywood was now the center of attention. The footage captured by bystanders had gone viral, showing Davis aggressively handling the judge without cause. The video circulated on social media, news outlets, and even talk shows. The outrage was palpable. In the days following the incident, protests erupted outside the Baywood Police Department. Demonstrators held signs that read "Justice for Reed," "Stop Police Brutality," and "End Racial Profiling Now." Crowds gathered daily, their chants growing louder as more people joined the movement. What had started as a local injustice had transformed into a symbol of the systemic issues that plagued policing across the country. Inside the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers went about their work under the watchful eyes of the media and public scrutiny. Every move they made was being dissected, and the pressure on the department was mounting. Chief Harris sat at his desk, staring at the endless emails and messages flooding his inbox. The mayor had already called several times, demanding an explanation for how things had escalated so disastrously. The Department of Justice had launched an investigation into the arrest, and Harris knew it was only a matter of time before heads started to roll. In the corner of the office, Rachel Monroe, the department's lawyer, stood with her arms crossed, her face set in a grim expression. "They want Davis gone," Rachel said flatly, her voice devoid of emotion. "The public is calling for his resignation, and the DOJ is pushing hard for a formal suspension. If we don't act fast, this could get even worse." Harris rubbed his temples, the stress evident on his face. "And what about the department? Are we looking at more disciplinary actions?" Rachel sighed. "It's not just about Davis anymore. The DOJ is looking into complaints of racial profiling going back years. This is the crack that's opening up the floodgates. If they find systemic issues, the entire department could face a complete overhaul." Harris leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the situation press down on him. He had known about the complaints. Some he had ignored, others he had brushed aside. But now, everything was coming back to haunt him. "We have no choice," Rachel continued. "We need to suspend Davis immediately and issue a public statement. If we don't, the mayor is going to force our hand." Harris nodded reluctantly. "Do it. I'll notify Davis." At his apartment, Officer Davis sat on his couch, watching the news coverage of the protests outside the station. His face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as he flipped through the channels. Every station was talking about him, about how he had brutalized a black man, how he had racially profiled someone in broad daylight. But no one was mentioning the fact that he had no idea who Marcus Reed was at the time of the arrest. His phone buzzed on the table, but Davis ignored it. He had received dozens of calls and texts from his colleagues, some offering support, others advising him to stay low and avoid the media. But it didn't matter. He knew what was coming. The door to his apartment opened, and his wife, Emily, walked in, her face etched with worry. "Davis, we need to talk." He turned off the TV and faced her, his expression grim. "I know what you're going to say." Emily sat down beside him, her eyes searching his. "They're suspending you, aren't they?" Davis nodded slowly. "I just got the call. I have to turn in my badge tomorrow." Emily exhaled sharply, the weight of the news sinking in. "I don't understand how this happened. You're not a bad person, Davis. How did it get this far?" Davis ran a hand through his hair, frustration and anger boiling beneath the surface. "I don't know. I didn't even know who he was. I thought I was just doing my job." "But you didn't do your job," Emily said softly, her voice filled with sadness. "You went too far. And now you're paying the price." Davis clenched his fists, anger rising. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't know he was a judge. If I had known, I would have handled it differently." Emily shook her head. "That's the problem, Davis. It shouldn't matter who he was. You treated him like a criminal because you assumed he didn't belong in that neighborhood. And now the whole world knows." Her words hit him hard, the reality of his actions finally sinking in. He had thought he was in control, but now he realized that he had lost control the moment he let his biases cloud his judgment. Back at the courthouse, Judge Marcus Reed sat in his chambers, going over the legal documents surrounding the investigation into his arrest. His name was everywhere now, and while he hadn't sought the spotlight, he knew this moment could be a turning point. The systemic racism he had fought against in his courtroom was now something he had personally experienced. And it was time to act. There was a knock at his door, and his assistant, Megan, stepped in. "Judge Reed, the media is asking for a statement. Do you want to respond?" Reed sighed, setting down the papers in front of him. "Not yet. I want to wait until the investigation is complete. But when the time comes, I'll have plenty to say." Megan nodded, understanding his caution. The protests outside the station are growing. People are demanding change. Reed stood up, walking to the window and looking out at the city below. They should be. This isn't just about me. This is about fixing a broken system. He turned back to Megan, his expression resolute. I'm going to use this moment to push for real reform. No more empty promises, no more sweeping things under the rug. This department needs to be held accountable, and so do the others like it. Megan smiled slightly. I believe you'll make it happen, sir. Reed nodded, determination etched into his features. We will. In the days that followed, the pressure on the Baywood Police Department continued to mount. Officer Davis was officially suspended, pending a full investigation by the Department of Justice. The protests outside the station showed no signs of slowing down, and the media continued to cover the story around the clock. The mayor held an emergency press conference, addressing the growing unrest. We are taking this matter seriously, she said, her tone measured. Officer Davis has been suspended, and a full investigation is underway. We are committed to transparency and accountability in this case. But for many in the community, the mayor's words were not enough. They wanted more than just promises. They wanted action. The protests outside the Baywood Police Department had reached a fever pitch. What had begun as small gatherings had grown into a massive, organized demonstration. The public demanded answers, accountability, and justice. News of Officer Davis's arrest of Judge Marcus Reed had spread like wildfire. The media had picked up the story, framing it as yet another example of racial profiling and abuse of power. The fact that Reed was a highly respected black judge made the incident even more explosive. Inside the police station, Officer Davis sat in an interrogation room, his head in his hands. He had been suspended pending an internal investigation, but it felt like the walls were closing in on him. Everything was spiraling out of control, and for the first time, Davis was truly afraid. His career, his reputation, it was all on the line. He had never thought a routine traffic stop could turn into something that would destroy his life. Davis, what the hell were you thinking? Sergeant Myers demanded, pacing the room. Myers had been called in to handle the situation and was clearly struggling to keep his anger in check. I didn't know he was a judge. Davis shot back, his voice cracking with frustration. He was acting suspicious. I was just doing my job. Doing your job? Myers barked, stopping in his tracks to glare at him. You assaulted a man who complied with every one of your orders, and that man happens to be one of the most powerful judges in this state. This isn't going away, Davis. You screwed up. Big time. Davis clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the sergeant's words. He knew he had crossed a line, but the reality of what that meant hadn't fully sunk in. He wasn't just dealing with a complaint anymore. This was a scandal that had captured national attention. Myers sighed, his tone softening slightly. Look, I'm going to level with you. The department's under a microscope right now. The higher-ups are looking for someone to take the fall, and guess what? That someone is you. Davis paled, his heart pounding. What does that mean? It means you're going to be thrown under the bus, Myers said bluntly. The mayor is involved, the DOJ is watching, and the public is out for blood. They're not going to protect you from this. Davis's mind raced, trying to grasp the full extent of the situation. He had always thought that the system would protect him, that his badge gave him immunity. But now, the same system he had relied on was turning against him. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Marcus Reed was at his office, meeting with his legal team and advisors. His phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from colleagues, community leaders, and friends. The public was on his side, and he had become a symbol of the fight against police brutality and systemic racism. Marcus, this is bigger than just your case, Michael Crane, a prominent civil rights lawyer, said as he sat across from the judge. "This is an opportunity to push for real reforms. We can't let this moment slip away." Reed nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He had never wanted to become a public figure, but now his case had transcended his personal experience. It had become a rallying point for change. "What's the plan?" Reed asked, his voice steady. "We push for an independent review of the entire department," Crane replied. "We demand the implementation of body cameras, bias training, and most importantly, civilian oversight. The community needs a voice in how the police are held accountable." Reed considered this, knowing that Crane was right. The department couldn't be trusted to police itself anymore. If anything good was to come out of this, it would be lasting reform. "Let's do it," Reed said firmly. "We're not settling for anything less than systemic change." Back at the police station, the pressure on the department was mounting. Protesters were gathered outside, chanting for Officer Davis to be fired and for reforms to be enacted. Inside, the leadership team was scrambling to contain the damage. The mayor had called an emergency meeting, and the police chief was in over his head. "We need to take decisive action," the mayor said, her voice sharp as she addressed the room. "The public isn't going to accept a slap on the wrist. We need to suspend Davis indefinitely, launch an independent investigation, and show that we're serious about addressing the problems in this department." The police chief nodded, though it was clear that he wasn't happy about the situation. "And what about the public's demands for civilian oversight?" he asked, his tone resigned. The mayor folded her arms, her expression unyielding. "We're going to have to give them what they want. The city can't afford to be seen as dragging its feet on this. If we don't act now, it's only going to get worse." The chief knew she was right. The situation had spiraled out of control, and the department had no choice but to make concessions. As the sun set over Baywood, the protests outside the station grew louder, the crowd swelling in size. The story had captured national attention, and the calls for justice had reached a boiling point. Inside, Davis sat alone in the interrogation room, his career in tatters, as the full weight of what he had done began to sink in. Meanwhile, Marcus Reed prepared for the next phase of the fight, knowing that the battle for justice wasn't just about him. It was about changing the system that had allowed officers like Davis to act with impunity. News of Officer Davis's arrest of Judge Marcus Reed spread like wildfire. The footage captured by bystanders had gone viral, painting Davis as a symbol of police abuse and racial injustice. The media hounded the Baywood Police Department, demanding accountability. Calls for justice grew louder, and the city was thrown into a spotlight it wasn't ready for. In the days following the incident, Officer Davis was suspended, pending an internal investigation. The weight of his actions began to settle in as Davis realized he had arrested one of the most respected judges in the state. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. His arrogance and disregard for the law were now on full display, not just locally but nationally. Meanwhile, Judge Reed maintained his composure, refusing to be rattled by the events. He used the situation as a platform to speak out against systemic racism and the abuse of power by law enforcement. His voice became a rallying cry for change, and he called for deep reforms within the police force. As Davis sat alone at home, watching the fallout unfold on television, it became clear that his career was over. The Baywood Police Department couldn't protect him anymore. He had become too much of a liability, and the public demanded justice for his actions. Davis had gone from being untouchable to a man facing criminal charges for misconduct. The internal investigation concluded swiftly. Davis was officially terminated from the force and charged with unlawful arrest, excessive force, and violating civil rights. His name was forever linked to a cautionary tale of what happens when power is abused. Karma had finally caught up to him, and there was no escaping it. As the dust settled, Judge Marcus Reed continued his work, becoming a symbol of resilience and justice in the face of adversity. The reforms he championed began to take root, and Baywood's police department underwent a much-needed transformation. In the end, Officer Davis became a cautionary tale, a man brought down by his own hubris and racism. Meanwhile, Judge Reed emerged stronger, his legacy not defined by the injustice he faced, but by how he used it to inspire change. The system wasn't perfect, but it was evolving, and Davis's downfall served as a reminder that no one is above the law. I ask you to please comment on your impressions and opinions in the comments. I would feel very happy if you leave me a like.